the cloud. Okay, so we are now recording. And also, if you were on Twitter, please do use the hashtag LecRec chat. Although the one I missed out there was that please don't take photos of people on the screen unless you have their permission. Okay. Okay. So just to give you a brief overview of the schedule, so hopefully I'm going to not talk for more than another 4 minutes and give you an overview. We then have 3 presentations. So the first one is going to be Jill and Jackie, who are going to present the results of our focus group with Widening participation students. Then we're going to hear from the University of Glasgow's Widening participation team, and I'm really excited to have them with us because obviously they've been doing a lot of work in supporting Widening participation students through what's been happening over the last couple of months. I'm then going to present our new paper, which is not 10 Simples rules, as I've just realised I put on the screen, 10 simple rules for supporting an inclusive online pivot in higher education. And then finally, the last half an hour or so, I'm hopefully going to press a magic button and Zoom is going to allow us to have some small group discussions about what gaps there are in the resources and what we as a collaborative cluster can do to help support everyone in trying to make everything a little bit better for widening participation students. So just to give you a brief overview of the cluster, if you haven't joined us before, it's a joint effort between the universities of Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow. There's myself from the University of Glasgow, Jackie is from Aberdeen and Jill is from the University of Edinburgh. And we've all been working together because widening participation, what happens in each institution tends to differ slightly. You have different populations and stuff. And so it was really important to us that we took a sector-wide view of it. The aims of the collaborative cluster were to try and develop best practice guidelines to support widening participation students with lecture capture. Basically, we wanted to know how are institutions already supporting students with lecture recordings? What do students think of lecture recordings and how do they impact their lives? We wanted to try and build that evidence base so that we could actually say to the sector, this is the ways in which lecture recordings have this impact, because whilst we all anecdotally know the power of lecture recordings for widening participation students, there's actually been relatively little written down. And we also wanted to produce resources to be shared with schools and teachers, and we'll be presenting some of that later, as well as students themselves and widening participation teams. I think it's really important that we all work together with the various different aspects of academia. So these were the aims of the project, and I'm going to come back to them at the end to show you what we've done to meet these aims. But I'm going to try and stick to time. So, oh yeah, one more thing. The story so far is that we were supposed to have 3 open meetings where everyone could join. The first one actually happened. It went ahead in Edinburgh in December. And the main thing to come out of that meeting was that we discussed what does widening participation actually mean? Because each of our institutions and all the other institutions we looked up had a slightly different definition. And what we settled on was widening participation as an equality, diversity and inclusion issue, that rather than talking about postcodes, what we're really trying to do is ensure that all students can participate in university in a meaningful way. And Jill and Jackie will kind of touch on that a bit more, I suspect. The second open meeting was supposed to be in Aberdeen, but was cancelled, so became a tweet chat, and a lot of it centred on the immediate impact of COVID. The research and resources that we've produced so far, and the recordings and the slides and everything from those open meetings are all available on our QAA page, and that's also the page where we're going to be continuing to add our resources there. So if you'd like to look through anything from the previous meetings, that's where you will find it. Okay, so at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to hand over to Jill and Jackie, who are going to tell us about the research project that we've been running the last few months with the widening participation students. So, Jill and Jackie. I'm going to sit down. There you go.
Okay, also, I hope that you are now seeing our widening participation with lecture recording evidence from students presentation. I am trying to see if I can see the chat at the same time, but unfortunately, while I'm sharing, I'm struggling a little bit. So Emily and Jackie, I will rely on you guys to highlight to me or wave to me if there's something interesting going on in the chat. I can see your lovely faces. So this is a co-presentation from myself and with Jackie. Essentially, in our Enhancement Themes cluster, one of the things that really came out of our first meeting in Edinburgh was that it's sometimes difficult to talk about the student experience because we don't always have a great deal of evidence as to what that experience is like. And this is particularly true in lecture recording because it's very often a more recently introduced system for a lot of universities. We don't hugely know how students are experiencing university life with lecture recording when they come from these widening participation backgrounds. And so we felt this was a bit of an evidence gap that we could address with the collaborative cluster. We set up a series of focus groups to try and access student perspective. We ran 4 in total. We had 1 in Aberdeen with 4 students. We had 2 in Glasgow, 1 with 4 and 1 with 3 students. And we had 1 in Edinburgh with 4 students. All of our recruitment to these focus groups was done through our widening participation teams in our relevant universities. So these were often students who had been part of access courses and had unusual transitions into university or less than typical transitions into university. And we had a proportion of mature students on these focus groups as well. The one thing I will note is that the Glasgow and Aberdeen focus groups were in person. Our Edinburgh focus group happened in the very first week of distance teaching, and so our focus group happened via an online collaboration software such as Zoom. It was Blackboard Collaborate. But as is a real recurring theme, access to resources for these students is sometimes not easy. And so we did this via an online text chat as opposed to an audio discussion. It's actually quite a fun way to run a focus group. It's not something I've done before, but it was definitely something that I would consider in future for other focus groups. But it does mean there's an ever so slight medium difference between the two, between the various focus groups that we have running. In this presentation, we're going to discuss what I would call a thematic analysis of the work. So essentially, we've taken a bit of a grounded theory approach to this, trying to discover how do widening participation students resolve their time at university with technology. That's resolve not only the challenges that they might experience, but also any benefits and good things. We're trying not to take a biased approach to whether or not they're going to have a good or bad time at university. We did this with a coder who is Lee Murray, who was naive to the focus groups when she began. So she took the transcripts and she iteratively, thematically coded. Basically, she read over them over and over until she felt that she'd kind of summarized the concepts that were happening inside of them. And when she felt that there was no more new concepts coming up, that's called coding until saturation, she stopped. And then we refined these themes as a team. So what we're kind of presenting to you guys is a broad summary of what these students said. I really like analysis. Methodology is my thing. It's the thing I get really excited about. Thematic analysis is something that's lovely for condensing a large amount of data. It's a summary of what happened inside these focus groups. This is a really rich data source, and something I'm really excited to do is take a more theoretical-led approach. Capital theory, looking at how resources are attributed to people and to areas, is going to be a really interesting way to evaluate this material as well. What I will say is that in the last couple of months, we have all been very, very busy, and just getting to this thematic analysis was a huge amount of work, particularly from our research assistant, Lee. And this has actually been quite a lot of work to get to this stage. I totally recognize, for those of you who are methodology geeks like myself, there's a lot else that we can do with this data, and we hope to do that as well. The emergent themes that came up from the material can be categorized into sort of 6 broad topics. There's university life, inclusivity, time management and priorities, lecture capture, utilization and study strategies, how students make use of these materials. And then there's the perceptions and the concerns about lecture capture, which often ties into sort of academic life aspects. And then there are the student transitions themselves. I'm going to cover the first 3, and then Jackie's going to talk about the second 3. And Jackie will summarize as well. So when we're talking about university life, within these focus groups, our students were often talking about being a mature student, having different values and backgrounds to the rest of the cohort that they were going through their course with, sometimes finding that quite challenging to resolve, particularly when the rest of their cohort maybe had different priorities in a classroom or in a tutorial. And they very often lacked confidence in their own skills. I think this is a really nice example from our Glasgow participants, which kind of highlights this. So one participant says, I think recordings would maybe help students to have the idea that maybe they shouldn't be here, or they don't quite fit into university. Maybe they're daunted by the fact of going to lectures and sort of mixing in with maybe people they feel they don't necessarily belong with. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean, and then another participant says, imposter syndrome. Yeah, exactly. People coming from maybe disadvantaged backgrounds who are equally as capable might feel daunted by the fact that they're actually going to university. They might, I think they're a bit anxious about going to lectures. I think that would really help them, really be beneficial. They wouldn't miss out just because they're feeling a wee bit, I don't know, overwhelmed or something, I think. There's a couple of things in this quote that I really like. There's a lot of what you might think of as weasel words or softening of the language. The student is desperately trying to present this as their opinion of something, even though it's really addressing an actual concern, which I think we would all recognize imposter syndrome and the feeling of not feeling accepted into this new cohort is something that we know happens within widening participation students, and yet there's still an awful lot of softening language when the student's trying to present this idea. The idea of inclusivity covers a lot, and it's inclusivity in the sense of what we were talking about in the first collaborative cluster meeting, ensuring that everybody has access to the table. And so there's the issues of accessibility. How do you get to your resources? There are different study preferences. How do you, as a student, like to study? I would kind of caution against taking a sort of learning styles approach to this, but yeah, Emily's face is kind of saying what I'm saying here. But there are definitely different preferences, and some of this is not only a preference as in this is something that is effective for the student to study, but a preference that is shaped because of the resource limitations that may be on the student as well. So the preference is not necessarily an internal preference, but can also be shaped by external pressures as well. There's a lot of diversity and stereotypes, the idea of the typical student who's out drinking every night and then coming in and having a hungover time in a session, and a little bit of pushback from these students who sometimes feel that stereotype means they get tarred with that brush. And then there are a lot of health and learning needs, which is incredibly important as we are moving into this COVID time. How these students are, there is an extra barrier which can sometimes be invisible. This is from an Edinburgh participant. I understand Joe. Joe is in this case a pseudonym for the actual person. I had that problem as well. I am allocated a recorder from disability, but find it hard to use in seminars as it's intrusive. When in lecture halls, I felt I could record, but it seems wrong to put it on the desk for seminars as it's more talking. So this person, under even Edinburgh's previous guidance before we brought in lecture recording, through our accessibility guidance and policies, had the ability and was given materials that they could use to record every learning session because that supports their learning. But the very act of them, the student, who is not always in a position of power in a tutorial room, putting that recorder on the table, asking for permission, the fact that the student is the one that has to engage in that behaviour is actually itself a little barrier to inclusivity. It stops that student from being viewed as a normal part of that room. And then time management and priorities. This is very often about, again, balancing work and study. Sort of as a mature student, how do you ensure that you're able to support a home as well as studying? There's a lot of financial concerns, the pressure that comes with that. There's a lot of workload issues as well, particularly because sometimes students haven't necessarily identified how the best or most effective way for them to work is. And there's an awful lot of guilt, and this kind of ties into that idea of the stereotypical student as well, but there's a lot of feeling of, I'm not really doing university right. And that, I think, is a very powerful message. So this was an Aberdeen participant. In terms of balancing work and doing uni, I feel like in terms of other students, I probably don't go out and go drinking as much. I'm not that big on drinking anyway. It's not that big a deal, but I do sometimes feel like I see other people going out, like I should probably be doing that more. But it's trying to find the time between other things and trying to prioritize. You feel bad sometimes if you go out and you're like, I should really be working on that. I have some guilt behind it, which sometimes stops you. University is not just getting the degree at the end of it, but the social experiences we go through, the networks that you make, the soft skills that you learn, how to manage your time, how to decide when it's time to say, I've done enough studying, now I need a break. And we need to embody that more, I think, because this is something that our Widening participation students found very challenging. I'm going to stop talking now, and Jackie's going to.
Yeah, I'll take over. And Jill is my trusty assistant with the lecture slides here in case my internet connection bombs, which is done regularly this week. So I'll just move on to the fourth theme that we extracted. So this was lecture capture, utilization, and study strategies. Now this one I think is really important because in a way it busts some of the myths around how lecture capture is used. Yeah, for some students it might be a proxy for attendance, but for others it's a lifeline. So it's that safety net, that opportunity to look again. The strands that we found running through this one were clarity and time to process. Okay, so for, you know, they've attended the lecture, but they need time to process and digest the information. It allows them to return to specific elements of the lecture that was maybe particularly challenging for them, or material that they're just not familiar with. It also allows that opportunity to note take that just might not be practical during the lecture. For example, if the lecture is pacey, if they have trouble understanding what's been said, if the material is quite dense, quite complex, or for other issues, these have been touched on already, for example, health reasons, for people not necessarily wanting to make it clear that they do have issues with taking the information in, they don't want to use their own recording material, or they don't want to ask for it to be recorded individually. So it allows students to create this personalised study strategy that works for them, and it allows them to go back and revise. So I think to assume that students are using it as a proxy for attendance clearly isn't reflected in what we were getting back from our focus group students as well, and I think that's really important. So if we just look at a quote from one of the participants, and I think this really touches on everything for me. I get stressed out trying to take notes and listen at the same time because I'm always scared in case I miss something. But having that opportunity to go back, I can relax and I can take notes, but then I can go back and add bits if I don't understand it or go over things. And I think this rings with me because I can be a bit of a plodder. You know, sometimes it takes a while for things to go in, for me to process. And I think that's really important for us to give students that opportunity to study in a way that's comfortable for them, that makes life that bit easier. So we'll go on to the next theme, and that theme is lecture capture perceptions and concerns. Now this is really interesting. What we found here is students saying that lecture capture doesn't negate engagement or attendance. and they want to attend lectures because they do enjoy that, and they do value the interaction that attending a lecture actually provides. And that's a strong motivator for attendance. And that is something actually we really need to think about in this sort of pivot to online learning we're all going to have to experience or deal with in the coming year. But lecture capture allows for that flexibility, right? So what we were saying before, it allows for students to balance family, work, care and responsibilities, all these things that particularly for widening participation students, you know, take up a huge part of their life, but absolutely should in no way negate them from being able to carry out their studies. There's also the stigma associated with students who want to make the recordings of lectures, as we touched upon already. So it absolutely highlights this record for all approach. So if we record it at the time of the lecture taking place, it's there for everyone, regardless of their situation. It doesn't point anyone out particularly, and students appreciate that. What also came out of this theme was underutilization. So the idea that it's not all lectures are recorded, and there's a bit of inconsistency both across institutions, but also, you know, within an institution. So some courses will record, but some won't, and that can be an issue for some because it's a little bit like once you've had it, you know, you want a bit more of it. But this comes with challenges because if, and perhaps we've all been there, where the technology fails, the lecture doesn't record, and if as a student you've been relying on that, then that's quite a challenge. Okay, so you haven't taken notes during the lecture, you're relying on the recording, but it's not there. So how do they cope with that? So that's definitely an issue, and it's a concern that students highlighted as something that they feel needs to be addressed, and attention needs to be given to that aspect a bit more. And we'll just look at the quote from this particular theme that we've come up with. And one of the quotes from a Glasgow participant: "For me, having the lecture recording, I live quite far away and it costs me quite a lot of money to get in. So one the days only when I need to come in for an hour or 2 hours. If the lecture recording's there, I won't come in because it costs me quite a lot of money to come in for a very short period of time. So I will stay at home and watch the lecture recordings instead. But on other days when I'm in for, you know, a whole day, then I'll come to the lecture and then watch the lecture recording later." So this is a really great example of someone who wants to attend lectures, but sometimes there are prohibitive reasons not to. It could be financial, it could be work, it could be a number of reasons, and we shouldn't be asking students to justify why they don't attend lectures at any point. You know, there'll be many reasons across the board, but for students who want to participate, lecture recordings give them that opportunity, and finance doesn't have to be prohibitive. So I think this really, this is quite a striking quote, I think, as well, to come from that. And the final one we've got, the final theme we have is transitioning. Okay, and this, what sort of rang through this was self-management and independent learning. And what we found were several references about the challenges from moving from either secondary school or further education into higher education, the lack of knowing what to expect. This move from captive directed learning to much more independent learning, much more self-motivated learning and self-management is a massive jump. It's a huge jump for anyone, but for widening participation students, that jump can be something that they don't have the support within their family. Perhaps no one's been to university. You know, it could be a mature student who hasn't had that kind of experience before. A number of reasons. So it's not just about the academic aspects some of them are dealing with either. This can be about, you know, this can be about learning to manage their own lives when they come to university as well. And this transition is really important. But having something as simple as lecture capture can be there to help smooth that transition, okay, just to make that a little bit easier for students as they make their way through, particularly in that first year of university. So I'll just show you a quote from that came out of this theme in a second. Again, this is a Glasgow participant. Yes, so for me, I had, I'll probably describe it as continuous learning. Oh, see, my internet connection's going odd. So it's just it's not just the academic perspective, but so I moved away from home. So it's like that experience, a completely different experience of like living for yourself and managing finances, etc., etc., which has been a challenge I think I'm still getting used to. Okay, so our students are dealing with multiple aspects of changes in their life, and lecture capture seems to be one of the things that we can help provide. Just that transition, okay, a little bit of support around it, without too much, I say without too much work from us as academics. I know there's a lot of work goes into the lectures and the recording. However, I think we have to appreciate how that can feed into the positive experiences that students have coming into university. So that's the work we've been doing around the focus groups. And as Jill touched on, there is a lot more we can do with this. This is pretty rudimentary. This is us just getting to the crux of it now. I'm sure this list isn't exhaustive, but it does give an insight into how lecture capture can improve our students' experience at university. And that's really important. So at this point, if anyone has any questions, I think we decided the easiest way is if you post them on the chat, we can, and if you say, we can either read out the questions, or you can say you're happy to use your mic and you could unmute. So just give it a couple of minutes to see if anyone has any questions. Emily, I'll hand back over to you if you want to just take it from here.
Yeah, sure. Weird round of applause with like one person clapping for Jackie. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's so nice to actually see the output of that. It was such a strange time to be doing the focus groups, because the other thing that was happening was that it was this first or the second week of the strikes as well. So yeah, it was an interesting time to be doing focus groups on lecture capture with strikes and then 1 week and then COVID the next. So does anyone have any questions? I mean, there will be time to chat at the end if we want to. Okay, so Shelby says, do folks who do this regularly find a negative impact on attendance or student attainment? I think that's a concern in implementing in my organisation. Do you want me to take that one?
On you go, Emily. But I think we can all chime in.
Overall, the literature shows no systematic impact of lecture recording implementation on attendance. There are a few studies that have found an impact, but this seems to be very much dependent upon the course. And what students tell us is that their reasoning behind coming to lectures is very much about things like the quality of the teaching, or, you know, commuting, or, you know, unavoidable absence and stuff like that. So we're never going to say that there's no impact, but there's certainly no systematic impact. And actually, there's more studies that have found no link than have found a link. So that's not really an issue. In terms of attainment, the kind of more consistent story is that supplemental usage is better. So students who go to the lecture and then use it as a supplement tend to do better than those who just do one or the other. But I think it's really important not to look at the effects on attainment as grade point increases, and it's more about the context of that student. Like your widening participation student might not be getting an A, but it might have really helped them. So I think there are those things to take into account. I've now missed a bunch of stuff in the chat whilst I've been ranting.
So there's a question here, Emily, about do folks who do this regularly find a negative impact on attendance or student attainment? Oh yeah.
That was the one I was just answering.
Yeah, sorry, I'm good. My mistake, sorry, I'm going through. Attendances.
Yeah, Louise is saying there was a positive correlation with use of lecture capture. There are actually a couple of studies that have found attendance has increased with lecture capture. Those are very much in the minority, but they do exist.
I'm seeing a lot of chat where people are sort of sharing studies. One of the resources that we're going to be putting up on the Enhancement Themes webpage for this cluster is a list of useful papers and resources for building materials. There's also quite a lot actually already on Enhancement Themes focus on Technology Enhanced Learning Hub. There's a lot of resources on that as well, but we are hoping to put kind of a list of good papers and sort of commonly talked about stuff in there. I did see somebody asking a question, do other people have a video platform host for their materials? At Edinburgh, we have something called Media Hopper, and it ties into it. Edinburgh, we do an awful lot of open educational resource work, and so we're quite open to recording our lectures, and then if you don't have students in them, it's your lecture, you can do what you like with it, you can make it an open educational resource. I do that for a lot of my distance learning MSc teaching that I do. I just record the lectures and then put them up on my Media Hopper. Other universities have similar sort of materials, and then I think other universities try to keep their materials more inside. Trying to see what else people are saying. You're an awful chatty bunch, which is lovely. Josh is asking, is there any additional information in these studies about the makeup of cohorts, relative proportion of widening participation to traditional students? I may have missed the sort of preceding chat to this, so apologies if this is a bad answer, but I think this is going to be so specific to the individual institution and the individual courses and programs within that institution. Certainly, we did a session with Abertay, who are really good at widening participation, and they've got quite mixed cohorts, very different in comparison to, say, my personal experience teaching when I teach vet students at the Royal Dick School of Veterinary Studies. We don't have a very mixed cohort from a widening participation background, and that's very often discipline differences, sort of historical things about your institution. One of the things that I think makes me feel a bit like an imposter when I'm talking about widening participation is when I'm coming from, quite a homogenous group like the vet school. It's still important that we all take responsibility for this, in my opinion, anyway. But yeah, I don't know that there's good overall links, and I also don't know how much overall statistics would be useful in this case. I think one of the reasons I really like qualitative work in this position is because it supports, or it evidences the experience of a smaller number of people.
The question about the recorded lectures being used to break strikes, I mean, so Edinburgh, when Edinburgh updated their policy, they became the first policy in the UK to actually just explicitly say, we will not do this. And it's funny how few policies had that, well, no policies had that in before, and I think it's becoming increasingly common now that when policies are updated, that statement is being put in. And I think it's really important for senior management to just say, we're not going to use it for this reason.
Yeah. And to really toot Edinburgh's horn here, we also somehow, some wonderfully intelligent person put into our policy, it can be used in the case of pandemic. And we were delighted when we looked back a couple of months ago. We were like, we're the best. So, but yeah, a good, clear policy is super important.
Yeah. I'm going to be a good chair and move the meeting onwards. So jazz hands to Jill and Jackie again. Thank you very much for that. So we're now going to move on to the presentation by the University of Glasgow's Widening Participation Team. So Monica, if you could share the slides, and then hopefully everything will work out lovely.
Cool.
Oh, hang on. That's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to stop the recording and then start the recording again to make it easier to share the links to each talk. Right. So